Hello, Colonel. Welcome back to my channel.
Hi, glad to
Hi.
be here.
Yeah. Okay. The last interview that we had, I was quite disappointed because I actually wanted to ask you about Africa and Latin America, but I don't know for whatever reason, it becomes too Middle Eastern centric during the interview. So I hope maybe we can continue from the previous interview and maybe you can
Sure.
talk more about Latin America and Africa.
So, my research has basically, when I first started this and found out about Operation Gladio and these secret armies that have been embedded in all of the NATO countries,
Mm-hmm.
of course, that led me to say, where else have we used them? And what I found out was just like crazy because we've used them outside of NATO as they were designed by NATO for NATO countries. For example, during the Korean War, just prior to the start of the Korean War, there were stay behind units that were seeded into Korea. The
Okay.
same is true in Iran. In southern Iran, there was an entire array of stay behind units that were set up by the CIA and MI6
Mm-hmm.
in Iran in the southern area. They used the tribal area in southern Iran. They flew in military advisors, just as we did in Vietnam, and they created these stay behinds. And when it came time to overthrow Mossadegh, however you pronounce his name,
Mm-hmm.
they used these people to go into Tehran as foot soldiers and start the rabble rousing, just like the Nazis used the brown shirts
Mm-hmm.
to quell the people so that the CIA could mount their overthrow. They basically create chaos. They're chaos agents, but they're also trained to kill people. So they're trained to blow things up. So they create the atmosphere of the quote unquote rebellion and orchestrate a coup. As I said, they were in Vietnam. Well, Operation Gladio had a sister cousin organization, however you want to label it, called Operation Condor. And these same people in many cases. So we all know that the rat lines out of Germany saved a lot of the original Nazis working for Hitler. And those rat lines brought them in through Argentina and seeded them all throughout Latin America. What most people don't know is that Nelson Rockefeller and the Rockefellers in general, Standard Oil, all of their different companies had their eye on South America, Latin America, in general. So following the Iran coup, there was a Guatemala coup the next year, and it was done on behalf of the Rockefeller interest in United Fruit. Sullivan and Cromwell was involved, the same company that represents a whole bunch of different oligarchs. It's a legal body. That's where John Foster Dulles came from. That's where Alan Dulles practiced law. And they do it on behalf of these very wealthy oligarchs that have their eye on resources. So Brazil had the Amazon, they had rubber, just like Vietnam did, they had oil. And so in 1963, 64, they mounted a coup in Brazil and installed a military dictator. And from there, they went
Colonel,
to
if you don't mind, may I know what is the name of the president, the Brazilian president at the time?
the name of what?
Or the Brazilian president that they tried to coup, or maybe the year, something like that?
Arbenz. Arbenz was
Arbin.
Guatemala. Gilead,
Mhm.
um, I think, was the one in Brazil.
Okay, Gillian, okay.
Um, you can just go back and type in CIA coup in Brazil, and it'll come up.
Ah, okay.
Um, so it's a democratically elected. president
Mm-mm.
that basically wanted the resources of Brazil for the people's wealth, not the wealth of international companies. And that's not allowed. You're not allowed to use your resources for your own people.
Mhm.
So throughout the next 10 years, there were several other coups where they installed military dictators across South America. And then they get in 1973, 74, they overthrew Salvador Allende in Chile. And so they're just knocking off one government after another government after another government. And underneath the surface, in all of these coups, you find real live Nazis that had, like, Klaus Barbie, who had been ratlined out of Germany, was down doing experiments in Brazil on
Oh,
children.
mm,
And yeah,
wow.
so there's just this whole array. And if you move over, you were asking about Africa. So in Africa, they were undergoing after World War II this what they label as a democracy movement, where the Europeans that had colonized Africa was basically transferring them to a quote unquote democracy. But if the people elected the wrong person, they would just go in and overthrow their government and
Mm-mm.
they would install a leader. And the best example of that is the Congo. When Patrice Lumumba got elected as the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo, that was trying to remember the date. 19 the late 1960s is when he was elected, and on January 17th of 1961 he was murdered.
Mm-mm.
They arranged his kidnapping, and he was tortured, beaten almost to death, and then they murdered him. And they installed a Western controlled puppet in the government of the Congo. And the resource they were after there was uranium. And the irony of it is that the Congo had been a Belgium colony, and the uranium to source the Manhattan Project had come from the Congo. They were the largest supply of uranium at the time. So Patrice Lumumba knew how vital that resource was. He was not a communist. He was not ever going to allow the Soviet Union to have access to the uranium. He flew to America to basically say, Belgium has been mining our uranium and we're getting pennies on the dollar. I want to build schools. I want to build hospitals. They had been under Belgium rule for a very long time. And he basically wanted to deal as the prime minister of that country directly with America and cut the Belgium out of the deal because they were no longer a Belgium colony. He was free to renegotiate everything with anyone that he wanted to. He chose America. So he flies to America thinking that he's going to meet with General President Eisenhower. He
Mhm.
wouldn't meet with him. So he tried to make a meeting or schedule a meeting with Vice President Richard Nixon. He wouldn't meet with him. The only person, and he's a head of state. The only person that Lumumba was allowed to meet with was the Secretary of State. And he basically told Lumumba, we're not going to deal directly with you. We're going to get uranium, but it's going to go through Belgium, and we're not going to cut them out of the deal. So Patrice Lumumba goes home and he basically tells all of the Belgian military that was still running his military to get out of his country
Mhm.
because it was the only way he was going to be able to freely negotiate his resources. And he didn't just have uranium, they had gold, they had diamonds, they had all kinds of resources. And so the Belgian military, part of NATO, phones up Alan Dulles and says, hey, we got to get rid of this guy. And they got rid of him.
Mhm.
And
Oh,
that happened throughout Africa. And then in America, we were sold the story that Africa's just not ready for democracy. They're not smart enough
mm,
to, and most, like Patrice Lumumba, most of the heads of state were educated in Europe and America
mhm,
that eventually came to power. But if they weren't Americanized or Westernized enough, and they truly wanted what was best for their country, they were gotten rid of through
mhm,
coups. And this happened all over Africa. And then the story that's sold to us in America is they just weren't smart enough. They can't manage their own. They're not ready for democracy. They need a lot of help from us. Unfortunately for Africa, the people that were put into power were Western stooges. They were, very evil people. And they were enriching themselves at the expense of their people. They were bought off before they took office in the coup. And like in the case of the Congo, the IMF and the World Bank, which had just been set up after World War II to orchestrate all of this,
mhm,
they gave the Congo, under a brand new overthrown government, $10 billion loan. So now the people of the Congo is responsible for paying that loan back, but that loan never got to the people. There were no schools built, there were no hospitals built. It went into the pockets of not only Mubatu, who was the stooge that they installed, in and his family. It went to pay back all of the people that put him in power. And so the IMF and the World Bank, in my language, are basically a money laundering operation
mm,
that is largely funded by the West. Our tax dollars go to the IMF, to the World Bank in these loans that
mm,
is recycled back to the same oligarchs controlling the resources there.
yeah. I was just wondering, what is your view on, I mean, like, I feel I could be wrong, but I feel like most African countries, they have a more favorable views on China, but there is also reports that China is putting them in a debt threat or something like that. So what is your view? Do you think China is a better alternative than IMF and World Bank?
So that's a very interesting question.
Mm-hmm,
What I point out every time anyone brings up what China is doing
mm-hmm,
is that if, in the worst scenario, they were actually in a country building infrastructure under a loan program,
mm-hmm,
that's way more than the IMF or World Bank ever did. Way more than the World Bank and the IMF ever did. And accusing China of doing what the West has done for the
mm-hmm,
last 75 years is very rich, in my
yeah,
opinion.
yeah,
China's not overthrowing governments.
for sure. But
They're
also,
not assassinating heads of state.
sorry. But also, I am a little bit cautious about China because we do need to remember that before America become the global superpower, many countries were in favor of America compared to Europe, right? So I don't know, maybe this is just a tactic for you to win alliances and so on because you need them right now. So I don't know. What's your view on that?
So I'm not saying China's a good guy. I'm just saying you can't criticize them
Hmm,
using that line of thought because it's a double standard.
fair enough.
And if anyone thinks that another, yeah, if anyone thinks that another superpower is not going to look at the history that most people don't know and use it as a model to become a superpower, they're crazy. I mean, if you were sitting in China's position and
Hmm,
you watched the last 75 years of how America became a superpower, would you
hmm.
not try to replicate it?
But true, fair enough. Anyway, after our interview, Colonel, I did some thinking, and I feel like, if I feel like after World War II, what was the meeting in Rhode Island? Is it the Marshall Plan? Something to do with the Marshall Plan?
So the Marshall Plan
Oh,
was basically another money laundering
mm,
operation. So George Marshall is the Secretary of State, And they come up with the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan, we were told, was supposed to be foreign aid to rebuild Europe in order to allow them to start buying goods from the United States so they
Mhm.
could pay off their war loans, right?
Mhm.
Well, who benefited from that? The same oligarchs that got us into World War II. They've
Mhm.
just created a monopoly now because there's a debt. And Europe has to trade with the United States in order to pay off their debt. So, if what most people don't know about the Marshall Plan is there was actually not kind of, there was a covert element of the Marshall Plan. And that money was used by the CIA in order to build out their Gladio operation in Europe.
Oh, so it's like a
So
condition. If you want this money, you have to give us access to certain parts of your land in order for us to put our stay behind units, is it?
it really wasn't even that overt. So for those of you who don't know that much about Operation Gladio,
Mm.
in all of the German occupied area at the end of World War II, there were caches of weapons and stay behind units trained on the use of everything in these caches of weapons, which included rifles, explosives, currency, and communication equipment. And some had more items, but those were the basic supplies in all of the stay behind caches of weapons. And they
Mm.
were already seated all over the German occupied areas of Europe.
Oh.
So, I mean, but think about it. That's France, that's Germany, Yugoslavia. It's a whole swath of Europe.
Mm.
So the the problem with that is they intended to use them and not for the stated purpose of fighting communism in case the Russia or the Soviet Union came over the Volga Gap and wanted to take all of Europe, because they were never used for that. They were only used for domestic terrorism. Now, how awkward would it be if domestic terrorists, like in Italy, blowing shit up and shooting people, were doing it with former German ammunition and guns? That would be a little awkward.
Um, okay.
So they needed a lot of money, and I mean a lot of money, in order to change out all of those weapons to NATO Western equipment, Western explosive, Western currency, Western communication equipment. And there was a meeting called Operation Sunrise in the waning days of World War II, where a SS German general by the last name of Wolf had a meeting with Alan Dulles and a two-star Army general by the name of Lyman Limetzger in northern Italy. And the Germans had a list of people that they wanted ratlined out of Germany and saved. Alan Dulles wanted control of the stay behind network that the Germans had already set up.
Mm.
Lyman Limetzger's role there was critical. He was the chief logistics officer for General Eisenhower during the last phases of World War II, right?
Mhm.
So his job was to take the funding from the Marshall Plan, buy all of these excess equipment that the soon to be NATO countries had brought into the war theater, and change out all of those stay behind units from Nazi weapons to Western weapons.
Mm.
And I came across an organization that was classified at the highest level. As a matter of fact, their material and how they operated from World War II was
Mhm.
not declassified until 2014. Think about that. That's
Oh.
how highly classified Detachment A was.
Mhm.
Detachment A's job was to build these mobile, deployable tent cities over all of these caches of German weapons. So it looked like in the immediate aftermath that we were just setting up a military compound to include barbed wire fences and temporary tents. Those temporary tents were pitched over the weapon caches. The military members dug up those Nazi weapons,
Mm-mm.
exchanged them with Western weapons, and reburied them.
Mm.
And
Understand.
these tent cities were put all over Europe in order to do this logistical change out of weaponry, not to get rid of them, but to reconstitute them with Western weapons. And this went on for months and months all over Germany, based on the map that General Wolfe gave to Allen Dulles prior to the end of World War II. That's critical. Prior to the end of World War II at Operation Sunrise. And so these uh, Detachment A people were basically the start of the American stay behind units, because what their job also was infiltrating um, the Soviet occupied Eastern Europe, where all of these same caches of weapons were,
Mm-hmm.
and training people on not only where they were, like the Soviet resistance, so that if there were a need to use them, there were embedded stay behinds in the eastern part under Soviet occupation. The problem with that is the Soviets had really, really good intelligence. As a matter of fact, they infiltrated just about every effort the West made,
Mm-hmm.
and they just killed the people that the Westerns contacted to be part of the resistance in Eastern Europe. And they did that time and time again. The once the CIA is formed, Frank Wisner, who is in charge of this whole apparatus, he tried to insert stay behind units in Albania. He tried to do it in Romania. He tried to do it in Hungary. And every single time the Soviet infiltrated them and basically killed them, they tried parachuting people in. And almost every one of them was killed or captured.
I mean, like, after our interview, I kind of figured out that the whole thing about the New World Order thing, I feel like everything has already been set up. I feel like this region, this is going to be their role. This region is going to be their role. Like, for example, I feel like Latin America is going to be their drug cartel operations, and Africa is probably going to be their cheap resources operations, and Asia is probably the cheap manufacturing operations. And I mean, like, do you think my opinion is true or not?
So, yes, to an extent, but it's way bigger than that.
Mm,
When they originally in the late 1800s, the Fabian Society was talking about one world government. That's how old this concept is.
mm.
Um,
18th
they
century, yeah?
basically, I'm sorry,
18th,
the end of the 18th century,
end of the
or
18th.
I'm sorry, the end of the 1800s, the
Oh, okay.
19th century.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so they basically envisioned the world to be Pan America, where America led not only North America, but South America as well. They were going to be in charge of that section of the world. There was going to be a Pan Europe with Germany in charge. There was
Mm-hmm.
going to be a pan like British Empire. Originally, England was going to be part of Europe, but there was a little resistance there from the leadership of England. And so they were basically going to leave what at the end of World War II was the British Empire intact and give British a chair at the table. So they envisioned a governance that was like a round table where there was going to be a pan America, a pan Europe, a pan British Empire, a pan Asia, and there was a little quibbling back and forth whether that would eventually be. At the time, of course, they recognized China as Chiang Kai-shek and Taiwan, not China mainland.
Yeah.
Um, but there was a little quibbling between whether it would be Chiang Kai-shek led Taiwan or Japan. But that was kind of just, noise. At some point, it was going to be a pan-Asia.
Mm-hmm.
And Turkey was admitted into NATO as part of the Pan-Arabic area. They
Mm-hmm.
would lead that because, of course, they had the Ottoman Empire under their control already.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then there was no seat at the table for Africa at all. And they said in their own words that Africa was going to remain a labor colony
Mm-hmm.
and that it had so much resources in it that it could supply the resources with the labor colony. And that bears out in what happened to Africa in the immediate aftermath, right? They supposedly gave them democracy, but only under controlled leaders, just
Mm-hmm.
as I explained with the Congo. Africa was never going to be not a colony. It was just going to look like a democracy under leadership that they controlled so that
Yes.
they could continue to supply the world with all of the natural resources that are in Africa, never to benefit the African people. And
Mm-hmm.
that's why Omar Gaddafi was such a threat to them, right?
Mm-hmm.
Because he was a pan Africa advocate for Africa being its own entity. He wanted an alliance with all of the leadership of Africa to stand on their own. So he had to be taken out eventually. And his, idea of having their own currency and being their own kind of community was never going to be allowed because it is not consistent with the New World Order.
Mm-hmm.
So if you look at this table of control that the Fabians originally thought of, your theory about where all of the resources come from and how they're manufactured is kind of superseded by this big, ginormous organization.
Mm-hmm.
And if you're going to do a one world government, you have to have a unified paramilitary capability to take out, on a moment's notice, anybody that gets in your way. And that's where the Gladio program came from.
Mm-hmm.
These were deployable assets trained to be assassins, explosive experts, and you didn't find them just operating in their own theater. For example, the European stay behind units didn't stay in Europe.
Mm-hmm.
You find them orchestrating chaos all over the world.
Okay. And I was just wondering like what is going on with Nigeria right now? I mean, like, are there really like Christians Muslim divide, like they're trying to sell us, or is this also could it also be part of the Operation Gladio?
So, very interesting. Going back in history, when when in order to justify having these entities, you have to have what I refer to as a boogeyman. You
Mm-hmm.
have to have some justification for people to continue to fund these kinds of operations. So, up until the early 1990s, the focus was the boogeyman is going to be the Soviet Union, right? We're going to use it to justify all of this mass slaughter, cooing of governments. And you find it repeatedly throughout Latin America, where we can't have another Cuba. We can't have another Cuba. We've got to go in and overthrow Guyana. We've got to overthrow uh, Brazil. We've got to overthrow Uruguay, Paraguay, just you name it. There's a whole laundry list of countries that were overthrown,
Mm-hmm.
all justified by we can't have a communist government there. Those people were never communist,
Mm-hmm.
but they used the communist threat in order to justify these actions because in America, we were brainwashed to think that the Soviet Union was the big boogeyman, right? We were
Mm-hmm.
conditioned as little kids to crawl under our desk because there was going to be a nuclear fallout attack any minute.
Yes.
So that's part of the psychological operation that is played on domestic audiences in order for them to perpetuate this fraud. So in the 80s, it was clear to everyone that the Soviet Union was destabilizing and that it was going to fall. So
Mm-hmm.
we need a new boogeyman. So what happened?
Mm,
We baited the Soviet Union into Afghanistan, and we created and funded the Mujahideen, the Taliban, and now we've got our new boogeyman. It's going to be radical Islamic terror. And
mhm,
so if you go back to the foundation of all of them, Hamas was originally funded by Israel in order to attack the PLO.
mm,
Um, ISIS and Al Qaeda originally funded by the West,
right.
um, because it gave birth. I mean, it all came out of Afghanistan in the 1980s. So all of these terrorist training camps, all of it. So now we've got our new boogeyman. We don't have the Soviet Union anymore. We've got all of these radical Islamic terrorists running around. And obviously, one of their goals, because Christianity is a huge threat to these people,
Mhm,
um, attacking Christians is one of the um, I mean, it's a kind of a win-win for them. You get rid of Christians, and you blame the radical Islamic terrorists that you created.
mm,
It destabilizes countries.
mhm,
I mean, that's what happened. They've used them all over. Chechnya. Most of the Muslim radicals that were in Chechnya were not regular Russians or Soviet Union descendants. They were imported from the Middle East into Chechnya. The same
oh,
thing happened in Bosnia when Yugoslavia broke up.
mhm,
They have been exporting terrorists around the world in order to destabilize countries. And it's all done for the exact same reason, to control those countries. That's why you're never allowed to investigate the financial arrangements at the Swiss banks, at Credit Suisse, or Chase Manhattan, JP Morgan, any of those. You're never allowed to investigate the thorough investigation of terrorist financing, because at the end of the day, you're going to find intelligence agencies are orchestrating this entire movement.
got it. I know you are a Trump supporter, but I just want to know. I mean, I don't care about his policy in America. That's not my business. But as far as I'm concerned, I mean, like, I'm wishing you all the best, but that's not my business. I'm not going to cover much about that. But what I'm seeing around the world, I'm not the biggest fan of him, and I feel like he wants to fix American economy, which is fine to me, but at the same time, he wants America to still be the major power of the world, the superpower of the world. And I feel like both things cannot work at the same time, because we are willing to be your loyal slave as long as you give us market access. But now he no longer give us market access, and we the whole world doesn't want to trade in US dollar because we have seen that it's been used as a tool to bully nations and so on. So we would like to trade in other currencies, but now he's threatening other countries not to trade in other currencies and so on. So I have a problem with that going behind him. So maybe you can give some of your perspective on this.
So there's, in order to destroy the initiative of one world government, there's an overt way of doing that by saying things, while there's also the reality on the ground of what's actually happening.
Mm-hmm,
So um, I think if you look at what's actually happening and not my my way of analyzing this is not dissecting what he says. He has multiple people that he is conveying messages to. What I focus on what's actually being done. And if you look at what's actually being done, I think we can all acknowledge that every country has some form of their own deep state
mm-hmm,
that is wrapped around their intelligence organization, right?
Okay.
um, because all Central Intelligence organizations, with the exception of MI6, was created post World War II.
Mm.
There is I call them the Praetorian Guard. It is literally a guard between these oligarchs and the people. And their job is to make sure these oligarchs control of resources and people maintain itself. And just like I was saying, you have a Gaddafi. Well, we're going to deploy the Praetorian Guard to take him out. You have a Patrice Lumumba. We're going to deploy the Praetorian Guard to take him out. So they're kind of like the buffer between those two things. And what I see around the world is a lot of those Praetorian Guard elements are being taken out one by one.
Mhm.
And the things that they use for control. Now, the probably the best example is Saudi Arabia. During Trump's first term, MBS was not going to be the leader of Saudi Arabia. He just was not. But Trump working with MBS and I think it was over 40 of the Saudi family that was imprisoned, and taking out those were the really nefarious deep state part of Saudi Arabia that was they were being used to funnel the money to the radical Islamic terrorist. MBS is not part of that.
Mhm.
And so you had MBS come, and they tried to assassinate MBS in Las Vegas. That was part of the whole Las Vegas shooting. MBS was there that day. They tried to take him out.
Mhm.
Um, and the Kamal Khashoggi, the nephew of Aiden Khashoggi was the weapons dealer for all of this nefarious garbage going on. His
Mhm.
nephew, Jamal Khashoggi, was basically doing what his uncle had done, only he posed as a journalist. He was not a journalist. He was absolutely not a journalist. And it's not um, lost on me that on the 1 year anniversary of the attempted assassination of MBS is when um, he was murdered in Turkey.
Mhm.
He was taken out because he was part of that entire operation.
Mhm.
And so that was kind of the retribution for that, of being part of that nefarious thing. So you've got MBS in Saudi Arabia. He is no longer allowing the oligarchs in Saudi Arabia to participate in nefarious things.
Mhm.
And so again, if you start going country by country, what appears to be a random occurrence is really giving those countries the ability to clean out their deep state. And it is the only way that we're going to be able to transition to a multipolar
Yeah.
um, world order as opposed to this one world government that they have designed. And personally, I think that Trump is working with Putin and Xi.
Mhm.
You just saw all of the chaos that happened in China with the getting rid of a whole bunch of their generals and the communist leaders in China.
Mhm.
So I think there's things that we don't know that is happening in order to transition to a multipolar um, uh, uh, after
Mhm.
from the one world government that we were on the road to.
Okay.
Um, and so again, I just focus on what's being done. And to your point about the whole trading thing, the
Mhm.
petrodollar structure is gone. That
Mhm.
expired. There wasn't a big initiative by Trump to try to continue that. So again, I think there's a lot of things that are said as opposed to what is being done.
Okay. So it's more like a bluffing, in your opinion.
It's more like a what?
It's more like a bluff, in your opinion.
Um, I yeah, I there. So you can use the term rhetoric.
Mhm.
You in order for uh, Trump to navigate this road, you have this apparatus that's still in existence here.
Mm-hmm.
And for anyone that says, well, why don't you just close the CIA down? Well, there's been presidents that's tried to do that. Jimmy Carter tried to do that. He fired over 800 CIA covert operators in one day. It was called the
Wow.
Halloween Massacre.
Oh.
Do you think they went away? They didn't go away. They just go off books
Mm-hmm.
because they control the drug trade around the world. They have funding sources. They have trillions of dollars at their disposal. So they just kind of go off books, covert, and they just come back in as soon as Reagan took over from Jimmy Carter. They were all rehired.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is a steady mapping out of all of these networks to be taken down. You
Mm-hmm.
can't do that overnight.
Mm-hmm.
Because one person or one entity can't know where all of the banks are involved. Let me give you an example. We all know that 80 to 90% of the cocaine in the world is manufactured in Colombia.
Mm-hmm.
That's a fact.
Mm-hmm.
So not all of the people that are in control of that cocaine production actually lives in Colombia. They live in Honduras, they live in Bolivia, they live in Peru. Some of them live in the United States.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to know what that network is before you can take it down. Colombian president just traveled to the United States and met with Trump. What he was saying both before the visit and after the visit is, if you want to take this network out, the money's all in US banks.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that made me scratch my head. Not that I didn't know that already, because they used to create fake banks like Nugent Hand in Australia and BCCI in Pakistan. Although they sold it as a Pakistani bank, it was actually a London bank. It was registered in Luxembourg, all NATO. So but it was largely funded by the old guard in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. They were the money behind BCCI. So you have to be able to map out those networks, right? So the Colombian president comes to the United States and he says, I have a name of the banks. So I started looking into that.
Uh-uh.
That was very interesting to me that he was bold enough to put that out there. Not that he didn't have the information.
Mm-hmm.
And what a friend of mine and I discovered was there was a entity in Canada called Egmont. Egmont is like the Bank of International Settlements for financial transactions. Egmont it's called Egmont Group. Egmont takes 170 countries' financial transactions and consolidates them. So if our investigative unit in America for tracking money laundering is called FinCEN, FINCEN. It's in the Treasury Department. So if the Treasury Department wants to find money laundering, they get data from the Egmont Group in Canada, and they can track the flow of money through banks, through trusts, they can track all of the flows of money. So in Colombia, when the president of Colombia announced that he had the names of the bank, Egmont cut off his access to their financial resources. They discontinued his contract, cut him off. So do you think Egmont Group is really there to find money laundering or to hide money laundering? So again, I look at what's going on the ground, not what I'm being told.
Mm-hmm.
And with the cutting off of that, I was like, well, that's really weird. And it told me immediately they're hiding money laundering. So then on a completely separate project, I'm researching an entity called the Pilgrim Society. So for those of you who don't know, the Pilgrim Society was set up right after the Fabian Society in the late 1800s made all of these declarations of one world government. So like in 1902, the Pilgrim Society was set up in England.
Mm-hmm.
And the next year, an American Pilgrim Society was set up.
Mm-hmm.
And it was not widely well known and it was not widely talked about. But all of the powers to be in this oligarch class became members of the Pilgrim Society, like the Rothschilds in London, the Rockefellers in America, all part of the Pilgrim Society.
Mm-hmm.
So the about 10 years later, the Pilgrim Society in London
Mm-hmm.
created the Royal Institute for International Affairs, RIIA.
Mm-hmm.
And the next year, the Council on Foreign Relations was set up in America by the same families.
Mm-hmm.
That's weird. So, this is their foreign policy think tanks to implement one world government.
Mm-hmm.
Well, on this other project I'm working on, a friend of mine sent me a screenshot of the subsidiaries of the London RIIA in all of the European or NATO countries. Because, of course, I look at everything through NATO and Operation Gladio and everything. And
Mm-hmm.
it was really weird. Like five um, places down was Belgium's, talking about the Congo, Belgium's uh, RIIA subsidiary. Do you know what it's called?
No
The
idea.
Egmont Institute.
Oh.
Now, this is within a couple of days of each other. So I'm researching Egmont Group over here in Canada, and I
Mm-hmm.
find the word Egmont Institute as the RIIA derivative in Belgium. And I'm like, wait a minute. What's the chance of Egmont being used twice and it not be, because it's a weird name, right?
Right.
Um, how are they connected?
Mm.
Well, they're directly connected. The Egmont Institute created the Egmont Group in Belgium and then moved it to Canada.
Wow.
So you have the guys controlling this entire one world government in charge of detecting money laundering when
Uh-uh.
they're actually hiding it.
Wow. Uh, I think we're gonna have to cover about Iran a little bit because there's reports that the US have been sending their warships is it? I'm not sure. Warship or
Yes,
their
yes.
arrows what do we call? I'm very bad at
Airplanes.
this military military stuff. Airplane, yeah. So, the reports that the US is deploying on their military assets and so on. Are we really going to see a war? And also at the same time, I find Erdogan to be a very I don't know how to read him. I don't know whether this guy is he really sincere or is he also part of the globalist cabal? So maybe you can
Who?
Erdogan, Turkey.
Oh,
Mm,
Erdogan. Yeah.
mm, yeah.
So I think he had a come to Jesus meeting. He's been hanging out with MBS a little bit. Um, the one thing that Erdogan in my book has going for him is in Turkey.
Mhm,
Turkey was part, obviously, of NATO, and they also had their own Gladio program. As a matter of fact, their Gladio program was bigger than, in my research, bigger than all the rest of the NATO's combined, not
mm,
combined, all of the rest, because their military was largely trained by US. Their generals, everything. They were a controlled country.
mhm,
And if one of the leaders in Turkey, I don't know if you're how familiar you are with their history, but they had a lot of coups.
mhm,
So the military would just take out whoever was their prime minister at
mhm,
a whim if they tried to do something that was not approved.
mhm,
And then they would have another election and pretend to be a democracy and then install another Western stooge in control. Meanwhile, this Gladio network, as a matter of fact, the guy that shot John Paul II at the Vatican was a Turkish Gladio trained guy.
mm. Wow. Okay.
Um, so they were very much part of this whole apparatus. And Erdogan, when he got elected, knew that if he did what was he thought was best for Turkey, his general officers under the control of the West would try to coup him. And what happened? They did that.
mm,
And he defeated them. He was the only one that survived and counteracted a Western coup against Turkey. And so I've kind of put him kind of in an isolated category of a question mark because he obviously was onto the bad guys,
uh-huh,
right? I
uh-huh,
don't know whether he's good or bad, but he definitely knew what was going to happen and thwarted their efforts to control Turkey.
mhm,
Now, Turkey also was one of the only, well, they were the only NATO country that continued trading with Venezuela after Chavez was elected president.
mhm,
They supplied them a lot of food goods and stuff like that. So Erdogan is his own man. He is definitely his own man. Now, had he done some really interesting things? Yes. But I do think the relationship that he has with MBS, and MBS, I don't know if you know this, but MBS began working with the Iranian government. They created a joint port in Iran. So I think there's a lot more going on in Iran. What I think our US forces over there are doing, because you can tell that Israel wants a war with Iran.
mhm,
And in America, the same people in the MAGA movement that supposedly support Trump and the president of peace
mhm,
are all out, the neocons, on
mhm,
wanting war with Iran.
mhm,
And the majority of them are Zionist. They care more about Israel's goals than they do about America's goal and wanting world peace.
mhm,
And so to me, it looks like an operation to expose the neocons in America and all of these people that will jump on war after war after war while pretending to be MAGA and want a peaceful world order,
mhm,
right?
mhm,
The same thing with Venezuela. They these radical weirdos that are all in on overthrowing governments wanted a full land invasion of Venezuela. And
wow.
all we did, and I don't know if you've seen the videos of Maduro, it looked more like he was being picked up and rescued as
Yeah.
opposed to, yeah, it being a
Mm,
bad thing.
mm,
So again, it's almost like a rug pull. That's kind of a phrase that we use here, where you pretend like you're doing this when actually you're doing this. But
okay.
it exposes all of the duplicity of the people in America that have infiltrated the MAGA movement that aren't interested in peace at all. They are interested in war after war after war. That's what they want. That's how they get rich. And so I view Iran the exact same way. I think we're over there to ensure Israel does not attack Iran.
Mm, okay. So do you still have time, Colonel, or do you have to go?
I have probably about another 10 minutes.
10 minutes. Okay, maybe last question. Do you think we can beat this, Colonel? Because when I hear your interviews and so on, I feel like it's too deep. I don't think anybody can destroy this network. Do you think we still have a chance?
I do. I wouldn't be here if I didn't think we had, and I think that's our mission, is educating people into exposing what this network is and the critical nature of taking it down. And yes, I do believe we can do it. I think we see it being done every day. The massive amounts of global arrests that is happening.
Mm,
A lot of them. So we have to be very careful about consuming public information.
mhm,
Public information is going to be controlled by the intelligence agencies, right? We know that. Mockingbird um, was exposed in the 1970s. So the intelligence agencies not only own entire media organizations, they control hundreds and hundreds of international news sites.
Mhm.
So we're being fed a doom and gloom, or what they want us to hear,
Mhm.
while if you go to other sources of information, and that's why I think avenues like X, I have people from countries all over the world following me,
Mhm.
and that's the news source. That's where you get real information of what's happening on the ground, not from the controlled media that we're being fed.
Mhm.
So I see different operations going on around the world. You would not have ever heard in the past all of the shenanigans going on in elections in Europe, where they just tried to, didn't try, they did, in Slovakia, Georgia, what they're doing in Hungary right now to try to defeat Viktor Orban.
Mhm.
Um, those types of things in the past would have never been exposed until like 10 or 20 years after they happened. Those operations are being exposed on a daily basis now in alternative media.
Mhm.
And that wouldn't happen if there weren't what I refer to as the good guys gaining control of some of the sources of information. And also, the suppression of it tells you that while it's still operating, it's not nearly as effective as it used to be.
Mhm.
The coverage of Putin has been amazing. The
Mhm.
guy's a walking historian, and he debunks literally everything that people accuse Russia of doing.
Mhm.
And it's really amazing. And not only that, all of the people that work for Putin are on media, on social media, exposing them on a daily basis. And
Mhm.
again, we were never allowed to hear anything from Russia ever. It was all blocked. All we ever heard from about the Soviet Union and then Russia was filtered through the media.
Mhm.
And that's not the case anymore. You have Tucker Carlson going around the world interviewing all of these people, right? And I don't
Mhm.
care if you like him or not. The fact that he is doing that
Mhm.
dispels a lot of the. And by the way, the State Department controls issuing him a visa to go to these places.
Wow.
So if the State Department didn't want him going and doing this, he wouldn't
Mhm.
be going and doing this.
Mhm.
So again, and he's got like the biggest platform out there, maybe
Mhm.
second only to Elon Musk.
Mhm.
And so that's what gives me hope. The fact that these things are being exposed
Mhm.
and dismantled. Um, and I I view all of this as some type of concerted effort. And Trump can't do it alone. There has to be other world leaders that
Mhm.
are part of this with him. And we've talked about a few of them. I think Erdogan is one of them. MBS is one of them. Putin and Xi, the lady over in Japan. I think all of this is setting the stage for this new multipolar um, work. And as long as they're all working towards the same goal,
Mhm.
um, it is possible with all of their resources collectively to take this down.
Okay. I don't know if I have changed my mind on Trump 100% or not, but what you said kind of makes sense a little bit. So I've been feeling really what do we call very gloomy for a long time. I feel like there's no
Yeah.
hope anymore, but what you say could be true. So hopefully it's true. But anyway, thank you so much, Colonel.
The only thing I would say is focus on what's happening,
Uh,
not what they're saying. And that definitely changed my perspective. When I realized that basically everything that I had been told for 30 years in the military and basically my entire adult life was a lie,
mhm.
um, I immediately basically just turned off the messaging
mhm,
because the messaging is there to make you feel like you feel.
mhm,
It is there to demoralize you. When you are demoralized, you stop acting. You stop being the voice of reason. You stop being the change that you want in the world.
mhm,
Their psychological operations is to demoralize everyone. And they do that through a psychological warfare plan to demoralize people.
mhm,
And a demoralized person no longer acts in their own interest. They become just a cog in the wheel, and the wheel keeps turning down the road towards one world government.
mhm,
I will not allow them to do that to me. I have called out Trump on things that I disagree with on.
mhm,
If and you know, Venezuela was one of them. I did not want to go back in there in a ground war.
mhm,
I know what the cost of that is. I've been involved in that after 9/11. I was involved in that in 1991 when we went into Iraq. I was in Iraq.
mhm,
I know what that looks like on the ground, and it is awful. So again, you know, I didn't you know, I put my concern out there, and then I watched what happened and I had to laugh. I'm like, because it was not what they wanted, but yet they exposed themselves.
mhm,
All of the people that were like here in America that were like, yeah, we were America first. We want only peace and blah, blah, blah. They were the cheerleaders for going in a ground war in Venezuela. And I'm like, what the hell?
mhm.
Um, so I think in every one of these things, the best thing to do is get yourself in a position where you're not going to be the first with the information, but you're
Mhm.
going to be the voice of reason as it plays out. And it, for some reason, it never plays out the way the globalists want it to.
Okay, so thank you so much, Colonel. I hope
Sure,
you are open to come back to my show in the future.
sure, sure.
Okay, bye bye.
Bye.